I'd like to introduce you to Gerry Conway, who will bring us through the Technical Infrastructure Management CC content, what drove the changes, some of the details, and outlining the benefits of this updated content for users. Gerry.
Thank you very much, Sinead, and you're all very welcome to this TIM webinar. I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so describing the Technical Infrastructure Management critical capability that was recently made available as part of the IVI summer release. So what will I cover in the webinar? The contents are as follows. Firstly, I'd like to describe why TIM is needed and why an organization should invest in this particular capability. Next, as TIM has been updated from the previous version, I will briefly outline what has changed and what has remained the same. The bulk of the webinar will then concentrate on a summary of TIM, going through the definition, the structure, the categories, the capability building blocks, how it fits into the overall ITCMF, and briefly how it could be used to improve your technical infrastructure capability. And then I'll finish with a summary of the benefits an organization would expect if they were to use the TIM capability. So why do you need TIM in your organization, and why should you invest in this particular capability? Let us start with the overall business. As almost every aspect of a modern business, and particularly a digital business, has come to rely on business capabilities that are enabled by IT services, which in turn run on the IT infrastructure. Indirectly, the IT infrastructure has really become the backbone to supporting interactions across customers, suppliers, employees, and partners. Therefore, the management of the IT infrastructure will have significant impact on the success or failure of your organization. So in essence, TIM is a core capability if you want to run and support a successful business. So for TIM to be successful, there are a number of key areas that we need to get right for a digital business or to support a digital transformation. The first one is the idea of IT being a strategic partner. As the advent of digital has changed the nature of the IT infrastructure conversation from a purely technical to a strategic focus. As customers are clamoring for greater personalization, companies are facing new competitors, often from previously unrelated industries, and there is an unprecedented demand to innovate. So the management of the IT infrastructure must cover much more than the traditional just reducing costs. It must also earn the trust of the organization by becoming a strategic partner and by providing the required levels of IT service to support a digital business. The next thing to consider is the whole area of complexity. Modern IT enterprises are now more complex than ever. There are more technologies, vendors, and service providers involved, and these reside in more domains, for example, on-premises, in data centers, and in the cloud. IT infrastructure now needs to be more virtualized and interconnected. Mobile, cloud, and hybrid IT architectures require a new kind of infrastructure, one that treats a disparate, multi-vendor environment as an integrated whole. The next area to consider is the whole area to optimize the whole running of the IT infrastructure. Historically, the IT infrastructure was relatively simple, and as applications got more sophisticated, the IT infrastructure simply got faster. However, as the functionality and the rapid deployment of e-commerce, mobile apps, cloud computing, big data, and the Internet of Things, the demands placed on the IT infrastructure have grown exponentially. The requirements of a digital business places further demands on the IT infrastructure in terms of scalability, responsiveness, security, innovation and flexibility, while also requiring that this is done at a reasonable cost. So a modern IT infrastructure needs to support these requirements and has resulted in very different environments and technologies where virtualization, automation and orchestration are to the forefront. And the final one to consider is that the IT needs to be very responsive to the changing needs of the business. As driven by digital transformation and the explosive growth of data, organizations need to redesign and modernize their IT infrastructure. More than ever, the IT infrastructure needs to be responsive to the demands of the organization and dynamic enough to respond to changing environmental conditions. And to do this by providing agile, scalable, and innovative solutions at a cost that is sustainable. So, as TIM has been updated, I would now like to just briefly describe what has changed in TIM. TIM now reflects a more strategic approach to the management of the IT infrastructure, rather than a purely technical focus. The next change is, as we will see later on, we're using a layered approach where we start with the physical infrastructure, and then on top of this sits the application platform, next then the IT operations, and finally the IT service management infrastructure. I'll explain this in a little bit more detail in slides further on. And then the other need for change of TIM has been to incorporate new technologies and concepts, such as virtualization, containers, automation and orchestration, the use of cloud, and such things as infrastructure as code and converged and hyper-converged infrastructure. But there's also a number of areas where TIM has stayed the same. So we have continued to use a life cycle approach, and many of the building blocks will have the same context, same contents, and some of the building blocks you will see will be familiar to you. I would now like to place TIM capability in the context of the overall IT CMF and its overall architecture. On this slide, we show on the top here the 4 macro capabilities, and then all of the other 36 critical capabilities. As you would expect, TIM is part of the macro capability that manages the IT capability, and it's shown here. So I just wanted to kind of show you where TIM sits in the overall context of the IT CMF architecture. So how do we go about developing and updating the TIM capability? Our starting point was the original legacy TIM that has been used over a number of years. We then conducted a literature review with the emphasis on a digital context, and we looked at both the academic and practitioner literature that was available and relevant. And an interesting thing to note is, due to the rapid rate of change in this area, the practitioner literature was a fair bit ahead of the academic literature. We then used extensive consultation with subject matter experts so that we could develop TIM based on both the legacy CC we had and the new information we'd got from the literature review. At this point, I would like to mention the people that were involved in this. John Nolan from GM, Andrew Stewart from Compugen, and Brian McGill from Amazon, whose efforts really are responsible for the TIM I will be describing through this webinar. So many thanks to those 3 key contributors. And then finally, due to the nature of the subject matter and the many changes taking place in the industry, we sanity checked our thinking using webinars and conferences. So we attended conferences and webinars from Gartner, Forrester, and industry leaders such as Cisco, HP, IBM, Microsoft, and Intel. I would now like to go into a little bit of detail on TIM. So let's start with its definition. The technical infrastructure management capability is the ability to manage an organization's IT infrastructure across the complete life cycles of transitional activities such as building, deploying, and decommissioning, and the operational activities including day-to-day operations, maintenance, and continuous improvement. So we hope this is pretty straightforward and clear definition for TIM. Next, we look at the goals and objectives of the TIM CC. TIM needs to provide a technical infrastructure that is available, stable, and reliable. It's a kind of core requirement. The second thing is that TIM needs to provide a technical infrastructure that is adaptable and flexible, and by using forward planning that addresses business volumes, variances, and velocities, and doing this while creating, acquiring, improving, and disposing of infrastructure components. The third goal is that TIM needs to provide seamless interoperability across different kinds of infrastructure components. I mean, today's infrastructure is not in-house anymore. It's in data centers, it can be outsourced, and it can be in the cloud. The next area, or the next goal is, there's a current focus on data protection. So TIM needs to protect not alone the technical infrastructure itself, but the data running on that infrastructure. And it needs to do it throughout its life cycle of storage, processing, transfer, and its successful destruction. And finally, TIM needs to make provision for the effective utilization of the infrastructure so that the organization gets a good return on its investment. I mentioned earlier the layered approach that we've adopted using TIM. So I would now, by describing the categories and the capability building blocks, I hope to illustrate how we've done this. So our first category is the actual physical infrastructure itself. And the CBBs that sit underneath this manage your server, storage, network, infrastructure, and your device infrastructure like your handhelds, your mobiles, your printers, and so forth. You need to manage the data center itself, and then a new CBB here caters for software-defined infrastructure. And the final CBB within this category is outsourcing. So how do you outsource, the physical infrastructure to the cloud and so forth? Then sitting on top of this is the actual platform, which is the following CBBs. The operating system, you need to manage virtualization, you need to manage containers, and you need to manage your middleware. And the next category is the IT operations management, which has a large number of CCs, which I'll briefly go through. There's ones to cater for change, configuration, and asset management. You need to consider how you deal with incident and problem management, how you deal with capacity and disaster recovery. You need to consider your security and identity management. Then the whole area of infrastructure availability and continuity, and the performance of the infrastructure so that it conforms to SLAs and that it delivers to the requirements of the organization. Then you need to consider things like automation and orchestration. Very important, as I highlighted earlier, in the whole area of optimizing the whole IT infrastructure. And finally, you need to consider how you're going to manage your applications that are sitting on the infrastructure. And then the final category is for service management. the CBBs here are used so that you can design, implement, operate and improve your services overall. Within the master deck introduces and provides an overview of TIM. The questionnaire is used to assess both your current and target maturity level in the future. The POMS provides detailed practices, outcomes and metrics at each level of maturity to support capability diagnostics and improvement. And finally, there is a position paper that gives an overview of the CC. It sets the context and summarises the research that we've done, both academic and practitioner. So that gives you an idea of the toolkit that you would be provided if you were to use the TIM CC. Let us now consider some of the key challenges that are posed by digital and how they can be addressed by TIM. One of the most fundamental challenges is that the infrastructure is available and can cope with peaks and troughs and can be recovered quickly in the event of a disaster. So TIM has responded to this challenge by using availability, continuity and disaster recovery to address this particular challenge. The next one I've highlighted here is that, as we've seen through our research, that IT needs to become a strategic partner, as the management of the IT infrastructure needs to cover much more than the traditional requirement of just reducing costs while keeping the lights on. So TIM is positioned now to earn the trust of the organisation by providing the required levels of IT services to support digital transformation. The last challenge I've highlighted is to manage the complexity of the IT infrastructure. TIM does this by using strategies such as virtualization, automation, and optimization. And these are combined with the appropriate tools and processes so that a disparate multi-vendor environment is treated as an integrated whole. So I'd now like to delve a little bit into TIM and see how you could, based on the challenges we've seen on the previous slide, how TIM could work in reality. Now, let's focus on a specific challenge. So I've picked the maximise business uptime. And in this instance, I'm going to look at the challenge, of the business uptime, as I just said. So how TIM handles that is capacity planning, disaster recovery, infrastructure availability and continuity, and IT outsourcing. Now, I have chosen just to focus on disaster recovery as given the time constraints of the webinar. So what I've done is I've taken this particular requirement, and then we look at the questionnaire that is provided as part of the toolkit. And in this instance, the question is, what is in place? The disaster recovery question is quite simple. What is in place to recover the IT infrastructure following a disaster? Let us consider a moment the potential value of this questionnaire. So if, for example, somebody responded to this question as option one, in other words, there's very little in place for any disaster recovery. Just by looking at this questionnaire and seeing the other options, it shows what is available and is already getting somebody to kind of think, well, if I looked at option 2 or 3, maybe that's the best way forward for me and to improve how I might go about improving disaster recovery. For the sake of the example, I have chosen a response of 3 to the current maturity and a response of 5 to the target or desired level of maturity. So based on these answers, I would like to show now how can be used in connection with the POMS. So as I said, the individual respondent said that they are at level 3, which is basically saying that they have a documented and tested a recovery plan, and that it covers most of the IT infrastructure. To get to level 4, briefly, they would have to automate some of the recovery, and it would need to cover the complete infrastructure. And if they wanted to get to level 5, as in this instance, they would then need to fully automate, and they would need to consider not alone within the organization, but the extended enterprise. So what I'm trying to get across here is that by combining the questionnaire and the POMs, it provides an organization with a really powerful tool to both plan, execute, and monitor progress towards capability improvement. I've presented a single response for a single individual, but now let us look at a combined response for the whole organization, which is on the next slide. So what we've done here is that we've combined all of the scores of the individuals within an organization who have taken the questionnaire to provide a mean score. So in this instance, we're showing a gap between the current and the future maturity level on this x-axis here, the maturity gap. And we're showing its importance here to the organization on the x-axis. Now in the questionnaire I briefly showed you, I didn't show the importance, I just showed you the current and future maturity. But in the questionnaire it also asks you to rate the importance. So for this particular questionnaire, in this example, disaster recovery here is showing a maturity gap of 1.4 and an importance to the organization of 3.1. And for capacity management, the maturity gap is 1.5 and the importance is roughly around 3. So what this chart quickly identifies, the really high priority items, anyone's in this quadrant here, so they have a high maturity gap and a high importance to the organization. What also might be worth considering is the low hanging fruit here, which are important to the organization but don't have a very high maturity gap. So this quickly identifies, as I was saying, the high priority and the low hanging fruit. So an organization can then decide what to incorporate into any capability improvement it may want to do for TIM. So this concludes really a quick whistle-stop tour, as Sinead said earlier, on TIM. So just before I finish, I would like to go through what would be the expected benefits if you were to invest in the TIM capability. Well, the first one is that TIM will help enable a strategic partnership between IT and the business. And as we've seen, like, this is a very important requirement for a digital business. The second one is that TIM supports digital transformation and the explosive growth of data by designing, planning, building, and modernizing the IT infrastructure. Third benefit is that TIM ensures that the IT infrastructure delivers and maintains a reliable, secure, and agile environment that can meet the changing needs of the organization. TIM also ensures that the IT infrastructure supports innovation and the ability to quickly introduce, test, and try out new applications and new ways of doing business. And finally, TIM ensures that the IT infrastructure is both cost-effective and is readily scalable to meet fluctuating business demands. That concludes my section of the webinar. Thank you very much for your time, and I now would like to hand over to Sinead.
So, thank you so much. This is really quite a complex and fascinating area of IT management. But if we have no further questions, then it just remains for me to let you all know how to get further information about the framework or our assessments. Your first port of call would be our website at www.ivi.ie, where you can keep up to date on our webinar schedule, recent publications, and our blogs. We'd like to invite you to join our global community on LinkedIn if you haven't already. You can search for IVI Global Community or go directly to the group URL, which is on your screen at the moment. You are, of course, always welcome to email me or Gerry directly if you have specific questions about what you've seen today. You might also like to contact Paul Goddard, the Channel and Partner Manager at IVI. We would be delighted